Now, democracy seemed like a good idea to the masses, but to the elites, democracy seemed like mob rule. The idea was, to the elites, even a lot of the founders, a government that was purely democratic would not let the better sort, back to your idea of deference, the better sort of people, the ones that could make the proper decisions for everyone as they saw it, would not let them rule. And so these leveling constitutions that made life even Steven for everyone seemed to move towards, in the view of the elites, anarchy. The real kicker for this, the real dominant factor that shakes people up on this issue, winds up being Shays' Rebellion. This sort of ties in many ways with stuff from our linkage from our earlier lessons, the Paxton Boys, Carolina Regulators, even all the way back to 1676 and Bacon's Rebellion. What happens in Western Massachusetts is money's not being printed fast enough, but each state can print their own money. So you've got this sort of fiscal chaos going on with 13 different forms of money that Congress can't regulate. But there's high property taxes and poll taxes in Massachusetts. So the creditors, people that are loaning out the money, they want their money back, they want their bills and mortgages and loans paid out, and the people that are feeling the squeeze are the debtors. Ultimately, in an economic crisis, there's a credit crunch in the late 1780s because our economy is not producing, and the debtors, farmers, workers, those who owed money, those who owed mortgages, they appealed to the state government for what were called stay laws, laws that would kind of slow down or put a temporary hold on foreclosure to allow people to kind of get back on their feet. The state house in Massachusetts was controlled by the elites, by those that had the money, those that were the creditors. They denied this. It's like hitting a stone wall, wouldn't allow any change in payment dates, and would allow foreclosures to go forward. So the government being controlled by these elites meant you've got class tensions. You've got the have-nots feeling like the rules are being made over them by the haves in ways that don't benefit them. So the resentment of distant authority not meeting their local needs. This was all the talk of the Paxton Boys, Carolina Regulators, and Bacon's Rebellion from separate instances. So you can tie these events together, whether you're writing a paper or simply through the historical narrative as you're explaining the history, in terms of this is one of those big tensions in American history. People on the ground feeling their needs are not being met by the government that is controlled by elites and sort of being puppeteered from behind. So what happens? A former Revolutionary War officer, Daniel Shays, leads a bunch of farmers and people that are being foreclosed against to courthouses in Massachusetts and holds them hostage and refuses to allow foreclosures to go through. The federal government, as you now know, is powerless to stop this. A bunch of angry farmers with pitchforks and shotguns, the United States federal government cannot stop them because there's no United States Army. Why? Because we originally thought having an army would be a standing force in our midst, which would be bad. So ultimately this rebellion gets put down by the Massachusetts militia, which shows up and restores order. But the result is the Articles of Confederation are completely exposed for all to see is a government that's inadequate. It's a government that can't govern. It was the so-called rope of sand from Lesson 8 that we were talking about. And it sends a big signal to many of the founders that this is the low point of the post-revolutionary period, that everything that they thought they'd worked and fought for to establish a nation state separate from Britain may just simply collapse and wilt of its own. And maybe all the European powers were right. Any Republican experiment that gets set up here is bound to fail because the Americans can't make it work, because nobody could make something like this work. This leads in many ways to then the rise of federalism. Federalism comes about as a political philosophy in opposition to the egalitarian leveling of the post-revolutionary period, which argues that we may have gotten too democratic. And being too democratic, or back to our pendulum model, being too democratic might be just as bad as being not democratic enough. And they say we've swung to too much of an extreme of mob rule, of no real order, and you can't have liberty without order. Some order, they argue. So they want to try to swing us back more towards a position with a stronger central government that was going to be able to have at least enough muscular strength to keep the cohesion of this federal union. This was the logic behind then first the Annapolis Convention, but then the Philadelphia Convention, which you know is the Constitutional Convention of 1787. It's a great meeting of a generation of American minds. Many of the initial founders that we'd seen from the Revolutionary period were there. You saw most are college educated. They were different than most of the people of their day. They were mostly college educated, many trained in law, many had written their own state constitutions. They were quite young for their time, and many of them had been leaders within their states prior to moving on to try to engage in this national experiment. And so they have to decide, first of all, Do we revise the articles or do we rewrite them? They ultimately decide the articles are too broken to revise, so they need to start from scratch. So on the third day of a convention that was called to modify the Articles of Confederation, for all intents and purposes, this group in this room, they lock the doors and they agree to overthrow the government. That's largely what happens. They scrap the old model and they say we need to start with a new governing document from scratch. That governing document, you know, is the United States Constitution. The key issues, the points of negotiation or contention of this document, first of all, as you ought to know from middle school and definitely high school, particularly your American government class when you have to take it if you take a constitution exam in your state, is the issue of state representation. The Virginia plan, or so-called big state plan, and the New Jersey plan, the so-called little state plan. Was the new Congress going to have representation where every state got the same number of votes, or the states with more people got more votes? There were drawbacks to each side because obviously the little states don't want to get overrun. The big states don't want to be led around by the nose by the little states. The Great Compromise winds up being, a history word, the bicameral or two-house legislature, where the lower house, the house where tax bills, revenues will come from, is the House of Representatives. Enrollment is based on state population. The more people in your state, the more representatives you'll get in this house. And the upper chamber, the Senate, is where everyone's even Steven. Every state gets 2 votes so that the little states do not get overrun in this process as well. A bill starts in the House, works its way up to the Senate. Electoral College and 3/5 compromise were the 2 next issues that had to be dealt with. It's enough for you to know, for the purposes of the AP exam, that the 3/5 compromise meant that for population purposes, for allocating how many seats you got in the House of Representatives, slaves in these states who could not vote, who were non-citizens, would count as 3/5 of a person. Not a whole person, because the North argued they shouldn't count at all, but not a no count, because the South argued this was the peasant class of the South and they ought to count. And they threatened to sink the convention if they didn't get it, because they was going to give them proportional representation in government to the degree that they liked. Electoral College is further proof, for multiple choice purposes in many ways on the AP exam, it's further proof that the founders did not trust democracy. If you look at the way the Constitution is set up, the common people had direct voice in the original text of the Constitution over exactly 1/2 of one branch of government. The common people could elect people to the House of Representatives. Senators were originally chosen by state legislators and in the state capitol. And state legislators tended to be the more well-off, the better sort, the upper-class people of their states who could be trusted to make the right kinds of decisions. And the Electoral College meant people did not vote directly for the president. You voted for a slate of electors who were also picked by the elite peoples of their states and the state legislatures, who would then cast their ballots. It's like a filtering process. And of course, the Supreme Court, justices are appointed by the president with consent and approval of the Senate. So in terms of the people having the voice, it's a very narrow compartmentalized spot where they have it in this government, and that was on purpose. The founders think they've learned the lessons from the articles of what worked and what didn't, and you've got to keep the people limited in what you let them do or not do. The founders distrusted democracy. State selection of senators, I've already referenced that a little bit, and additionally, end the slave trade in 1820. This winds up being something of a cop-out. They stall on this issue because slavery was an issue in 1776 with the Declaration. It's an issue now. The northern and southern states come to agreement, allow importation into the United States for 20 more years, and then stop from there, and the slaves we have will be the slaves we have. Lastly, the compartmentalization of powers. You know this in the common terminology of checks and balances. It's not just that the founders didn't trust the common people. The founders also did not trust power. After all, they weren't blind to the bad things about a central government under the British. So what have they done? They divided the power into the presidential branch, executive, legislative branch, Congress, and judicial branch, the courts, each of which can check one of the other powers. President by veto, Congress by overriding veto, court by declaring a rule or law of either of them unconstitutional, and judges appointed for life so no one can take them out, different election cycles for each of these people. They're trying to put the powers of government in tension against one another so that no one part of this government can seize and overtake and grab too much power. So it's an interesting dynamic at the convention. They don't trust the common people, but they don't trust an empowered government either. And so they're trying to strike this fine balance coming right down the middle between these two things.